8:15 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. An American E-3 Sentry. Early warning aircraft cruised at 30,000 feet over the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a standard patrol. The mission crew knew something was wrong the moment the first wave of Iranian radar stations went active simultaneously. The question that would haunt the analysts for years began right then. How could a military under heavy sanctions generate this much power in a single moment? The sky was a pale and empty blue. Below the aircraft, the Gulf was a sheet of turquoise glass that looked entirely peaceful. It was a deception. Inside the windowless fuselage of the E-3, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and recycled oxygen. The mission crew commander adjusted his headset. His name was Major Miller. He looked at the senior weapons coordinator. They were the eyes of the fleet. The mission crew was part of the 552nd Air Control Wing. Usually, they watched a handful of Iranian 4 Phantoms or the occasional 14 Tomcat. Today was different. The radar returns were not coming in pairs. They were coming in dozens. "Contact count," Miller said. His voice was flat. "Professional." The controller responded immediately. "Confirmed launches from Bandar Abbas. 16 primary tracks. More appearing now." "Sir, we have additional launches from Bushehr and Shiraz. The computer is struggling to correlate the signatures." "Identify the airframes," Miller ordered. "We are seeing everything," the controller said. 4s, 5s, 14s, even the older Mirage aircraft. They are all coming up at once. The count is now 42. 42 Iranian fighters in the air was a significant event. It was nearly a third of their estimated flyable inventory. But the climb rate of the icons on the screen suggested a level of maintenance and readiness that defied American intelligence reports. This was a surge, a synchronized push into the sky that suggested a total mobilization. 500 miles to the east, inside a hardened command center carved into the Zagros Mountains, Colonel Rezai watched a different set of numbers. He was the commander of the Iranian Tactical Air Command. He was not looking at a radar screen. He was looking at a digital synchronization clock. "The first wave is at 20,000 feet, a junior officer reported. "Engine temperatures are nominal across the entire formation." Rezai did not respond. He knew the Americans were watching the E-3 on their own screens. He wanted them to see, but even he felt a flicker of unease. The plan called for a massive show of force. Yet the data streaming from his own units felt too perfect. The readiness rates were higher than his last briefing. The fuel levels were beyond what the logistics teams had promised. It was as if the aircraft were performing better than their own specifications. Back on the E-3, the count hit 60, then 80. The Persian Gulf was becoming the most crowded piece of airspace on the planet. The icons on the display began to overlap. The software was struggling to assign track numbers to every contact. Each icon represented a pilot, a weapon system, a potential escalation. "They are forming up," the weapons coordinator said. "They are not heading for the border. They are circling. It looks like a holding pattern, a very large holding pattern." Major Miller watched the screen. The number hit 100, then 120. It was a statistical impossibility. No air force in the region, not even the Americans, could scramble that many airframes from different bases and have them meet at a single point with such precision. "Check the ELINT sensors," Miller said. "I want to know if this is a ghost in the software." The electronic intelligence officer checked his data. "Confirmed. We have active radar emitters from each contact. These are real engines. These are real pilots." 120 Iranian fighters were now airborne. They were orbiting in a massive, tight circle. They were waiting for something. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 8:31 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. The senior weapons coordinator on the American E-3 Sentry leaned forward in his seat. His eyes were locked on a single radar track. "Major, track 0042 is behaving erratically. I am seeing velocity jumps that the system cannot process." Major Miller moved to stand behind the console. He watched the digital icon representing an Iranian 14 Tomcat. The icon was flickering. 1 second, it was level at 20,000 feet. The next, the altitude reading jumped to 80,000 feet. Then it plummeted back to its original position. The speed indicator followed suit. It swung from 400 knots to Mach 6 and back again in a single sweep of the radar. Correlate with the SPY-1 radar on the Aegis destroyer below, Miller said. His voice was tense. The controller checked the data link. The destroyer has the same track. Sir, it is not a software glitch in our bird. The physical object is moving in a way that defies physics. The SPY-1 is confirming Mach 6. That is impossible for a Tomcat, Miller said. The airframe would disintegrate at those speeds. It would tear the wings off. 8:35 in the morning. Inside the cockpit of that Iranian Tomcat, Major Davari was fighting his controls. The stick felt heavy and unresponsive. Then it would suddenly become light as a feather. His cockpit instruments were spinning in circles. The backup mechanical gauges were vibrating so hard he could not read them. Control. This is Phoenix 1. Davari spoke into his oxygen mask. His breathing was heavy. I have a catastrophic flight control anomaly. My airspeed indicator is reading off the scale. My altimeter is failing. The ground controller at Bandar Abbas responded. Phoenix 1. We see you steady at 300 knots and 20,000 feet. We show no deviation. Confirm your physical status. Negative, Davari said. My internal sensors show me at Mach 6. The sky outside the canopy is turning black. I think I am leaving the atmosphere. Davari looked out of his canopy. The sun was where it should be. The horizon of the Gulf was level. His eyes told him he was in level flight, but his heads-up display was screaming a different story. It was a digital hallucination. He looked to his left at his wingman. The other 14 was only 50 meters away. It looked solid. It looked real. But on Davari's tactical radar screen, the wingman was not there. His radar showed only empty space where his friend should be. 8:38 in the morning. Inside the Iranian command bunker in the Zagros Mountains, Colonel Rezai felt the cold air of the facility. His technicians were shouting across the room. The professional atmosphere was dissolving into panic. The data link is corrupted, a technician yelled. We are receiving telemetry from all 120 fighters, but the numbers are nonsense. One aircraft is reporting a fuel load of 500%. Another says it is currently over the middle of the Indian Ocean. We have 3 pilots reporting they are in total darkness. Rezai gripped the edge of the metal console. Is it American electronic warfare? Are they jamming our satellites? We do not know, sir. The technician replied. If it is jamming, it is unlike any system we have ever recorded. It is not blocking the signal. It is rewriting the reality of the data. The fighters are still in the air. We can hear the pilots, but we no longer know where they are. 8:40 in the morning. Back on the American E-3, the weapons coordinator turned to Major Miller. The glow of the radar screen made his face look pale. Major, the entire Iranian formation just changed. Changed how? Miller asked. They are no longer in a circle. The coordinator said. They are in a perfect grid. Every aircraft is exactly 1,000 meters from the next. Vertical and horizontal, 120 aircraft. Perfectly spaced in 3 dimensions, like a cage. Miller looked at the screen. It looked like a computer-generated lattice. No human pilot could maintain that kind of precision, especially not in a mixed formation of different airframes with vastly different handling characteristics. It was a feat of navigation that was mathematically perfect. They are not flying those planes anymore, the coordinator whispered. Miller felt a chill. Then who is? The radio crackled. It was a broadcast on the international distress frequency. It was coming from the exact center of the Iranian formation, but it was not a human voice. It was a series of rhythmic, tonal pulses. It sounded like a heavy heart beating through a vacuum. Contact count is changing again, the controller shouted. 121. 122. Major. They are appearing out of thin air in the middle of the grid. 2:41 in the afternoon. The Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar. Brigadier General Sarah Vance stood in front of a wall of glass and digital displays. Her eyes were fixed on the master air tactical picture. Usually, this screen was a calm sea of green icons representing friendly forces, and amber icons for neutral traffic. Now, it was a chaotic hive of red. The Iranian scramble had completely shattered the standard operating procedure for the region. General. An intelligence officer approached her. Central Command is on the secure line. They want to know why we have not declared a state of active engagement, because no one has fired a shot, Vance replied. Her voice was low and steady. If we panic now, we start a war that no one planned for. What is the status of the Lincoln Strike Group? The USS Abraham Lincoln is 200 miles south of the formation. The officer said, they have launched their alert fighters. 4 F-18s are currently at the 20-mile mark from the edge of the Iranian grid. The general looked at the grid again. It was shifting. The 120 Iranian aircraft were no longer just holding position. The entire three-dimensional lattice was beginning to move south. It moved as a single unit. There were no lag times, no individual pilot errors. It moved like a solid crystal sliding through the air. 2:44 in the afternoon. Inside the cockpit of a U.S. Navy F-18 Super Hornet, Commander Stash Harrison looked at his radar. He was the lead for the intercept. Control, Harrison said. I have visual on the lead elements of the Iranian formation, but my sensors are giving me a heart attack. The radar cross-section on these 4s is changing every 2 seconds. One moment I see a fighter. The next, I am seeing the signature of a Boeing 747. The controller on the E-3 Sentry responded. Raven led. We are seeing the same. Disregard your sensor data. Use your eyes. Maintain a 5-mile buffer. Do not. Repeat. Do not lock your radar on any target. Copy that, Harrison said. He banked his jet and looked out the canopy. What he saw was impossible. Through the haze of the afternoon heat, the Iranian jets were shimmering. They looked like reflections on water. They were not flying in the way he had been taught. There was no pitch or roll. They simply translated across the sky. They slid left, they slid right. They maintained their perfect spacing with mechanical indifference. 2:47 in the afternoon. Back in the Iranian command bunker, Colonel Rezai was no longer in control. His communications with the pilots had become a one-way street of static and those rhythmic pulses. Tell them to eject, Rezai ordered. If they cannot control the aircraft, they must get out, sir. The radio operator looked up. His face was white. I am trying. But the pilots are not responding to my voice. I can hear them breathing. I can hear their cockpit alarms. But they cannot hear us. It is like the frequency is being redirected. Suddenly, the tonal pulses grew louder in the bunker speakers. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was no longer a heartbeat. It was a sequence, a code. One of the junior analysts at the back of the room stood up. Colonel, the analyst said, that is not a jammer. That is a transmission. It is binary. But the math is based on a base 12 system. It is not ours. It is not the Americans. 2:49 in the afternoon. On the E3, Major Miller watched the count jump again. 140. The controller shouted. 160. They are multiplying. Major, I have contacts appearing. Inside our own perimeter. Miller turned around. Inside our perimeter. Where? The controller pointed to the center of the screen. A new cluster of red icons had appeared. They were less than 10 miles from the E-3 Sentry itself. They were not Iranian. They were not American. The system could not classify them at all. Raven led. This is control. Miller keyed his radio. We have pop-up contacts in your immediate vicinity. High speed. High altitude. They are coming down from 60,000 feet at Mach 4. Commander Harrison looked up. Above his cockpit, the blue sky seemed to ripple. It looked like a stone had been dropped into a still pond. 4 dark shapes tore through the atmosphere. They did not leave vapor trails. They did not make a sound. They plunged toward the Iranian grid like spears. "I see them," Harrison yelled. "They are going straight into the middle of the formation." The entire world seemed to hold its breath. The 2 massive air forces were now spectators to a third player. The morning was over. The crisis had reached its boiling point. 2:41 in the afternoon. The South China Sea and the Persian Gulf. Commander Harrison gripped his flight stick as the 4 dark shapes leveled out. They did not maneuver like aircraft. They did not bank. They simply stopped their descent and hovered for a fraction of a second at 20,000 feet. Then they merged into the Iranian grid. The transition was seamless. The perfect cube of 120 Iranian fighters expanded to accommodate the newcomers. "Control! Did you see that?" Harrison's voice was a jagged whisper. "They just integrated. The Iranians aren't reacting. There is no defensive maneuvering. It is like they are part of the same hive." On the E-3 Sentry, Major Miller watched the data blocks. The 4 new contacts had no electronic signatures, no radar, no transponders, no heat. They were invisible to every sensor except the raw pulse of the radar. Raven lead. "Be advised," Miller said. "Rules of engagement are standing. Do not engage unless fired upon. We are declared at yellow alert." "2:54 in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian cockpit of Phoenix 1, Major Davari was no longer looking at his instruments. He was looking at his hands. They were resting in his lap. He was not touching the controls. Yet, the 14 Tomcat was flying with a precision he had never achieved in 20 years of service. He looked to his right. One of the dark shapes was now flying less than 10 meters from his wingtip. It was a smooth, matte black polygon. There were no rivets, no seams, no exhaust. It didn't seem to be flying through the air so much as it was displacing it. Davari tried to key his radio to talk to his wingman. Nothing happened. The radio was dead. The only thing he could hear was the steady, thumping pulse that had now synchronized with his own heartbeat. 2:57 in the afternoon. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The National Military Command Center was in a state of controlled chaos. The Secretary of Defense stood at the head of the conference table. "Tell me what I am looking at," the secretary said. A general from the Defense Intelligence Agency pointed to the satellite feed. "Sir, we have 124 aircraft in a perfect geometric formation over the Gulf. The Iranians claim they have lost control of their pilots. Our own E-3 is reporting physics-defying maneuvers. Whatever is in the center of that formation is controlling the entire group." "Is it a Russian hack?" the secretary asked. "A Chinese electronic warfare suite?" "Negative, sir," the general replied. "The processing power required to slave 120 separate flight computers from 3 different generations of technology is beyond anything we possess, or anything we project our adversaries will possess in the next 50 years. This isn't a hack, it is a hijack of the physical environment." 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Persian Gulf. The massive cube of aircraft reached the edge of the Iranian territorial waters. It did not stop. It continued south, straight toward the USS Abraham Lincoln. On the deck of the carrier, the klaxons were screaming. Sailors in colored jerseys scrambled to clear the flight deck. The ship's captain stood on the bridge, watching the horizon through binoculars. "Targeting radar is locked," the tactical action officer reported. "Phalanx systems are in auto-fire mode. Rolling airframe missiles are ready. Hold fire," the captain ordered. "If we fire on 120 planes, we are starting a world war. We wait until they cross the 5-mile line." 3 o'clock and 5 minutes in the afternoon. On the E-3, Major Miller saw the screen flash. "Major, we have a lock," the weapons coordinator shouted. An Iranian 14 just painted the Lincoln with a fire control radar. "It is a hard lock, weapons grade. The captain is going to fire," Miller said. He keyed the fleet-wide broadcast. "Lincoln, This is control. Do not engage. The aircraft are not under pilot control. Repeat, do not engage. Control, this is Lincoln. The response was immediate. We are being painted by 40 different targets simultaneously. We are in a defensive posture. If they move within 3 miles, we will clear the sky. Inside his cockpit, Major Davari watched his weapons display. A red box had appeared around the American carrier. The words, "Shoot," began to flash in his headset. He tried to pull the breaker to shut down the weapons system. He couldn't move his arm. It was pinned to his side by an invisible force. "No," Davari whispered. "Do not do this." The morning air, once thin and cold, now felt heavy with static electricity. The tension had reached a point where it could no longer be contained. Both sides had committed their full strength. Both sides were ready to fire, and neither side was in control of the trigger. 3 o'clock and 6 minutes in the afternoon. The Persian Gulf, the massive formation of 120 aircraft, was now less than 10 miles from the USS Abraham Lincoln. The sky was no longer empty. It was filled with the roar of 200 engines. The sound was a physical weight that pressed down on the surface of the water. The Iranian grid remained perfect. It was a monolith of steel and titanium moving through the air with the grace of a single organism. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Lincoln, the atmosphere was freezing. The tactical action officer stared at his screen. Every single one of the ship's defensive systems was active. The Phalanx close-in weapon systems on the ship's sponsons were slewing left and right, tracking targets that moved with impossible synchronization. General Quarters. General Quarters. The ship's intercom echoed through the steel hallways. This is not a drill. 3 o'clock and 8 minutes in the afternoon, on the American E-3 Sentry, Major Miller felt the vibration of the aircraft's 4 engines. He looked at the senior weapons coordinator. "Major, we have another surge," the coordinator said. "The Iranian aircraft are increasing their power output. I am seeing massive spikes in the electromagnetic spectrum. They are not just painting the Lincoln with radar. They are broad spectrum jamming every frequency in the Gulf." "Everything?" Miller asked. "Everything," the coordinator confirmed. "Satellite, radio, data link, even the emergency beacons. We are about to go dark." In the Iranian command bunker, Colonel Rezai watched his main screen turn to static. The digital representation of his Air Force vanished. The room went silent. The rhythmic pulsing sound that had been coming through the speakers grew louder and more rapid. It was no longer a heartbeat. It was a countdown. "The satellites are dead," a technician shouted. "We have lost contact with the southern coastal defense batteries. We are blind." Rezai looked at his second-in-command. "The Americans will think we have launched a first strike. They will retaliate. We have no way to tell them. We are not the ones doing this." 3 o'clock and 9 minutes in the afternoon. Inside the cockpit of his F-18, Commander Harrison was flying only 3 miles from the edge of the Iranian grid. He looked at his wingman. The other Super Hornet was rocking its wings, a signal that their radios were dead. Harrison looked back at the Iranian formation. The 4s and 14s were glowing. A faint blue ionization was beginning to wrap around the wings of every Iranian plane. It looked like St. Elmo's fire, but it was too bright, too structured. The 4 matte black polygons in the center of the grid were now pulsing with the same light. "They are charging something," Harrison thought. He reached for his master arm switch. He flipped it to arm. He did not have a radar lock. He would have to fire his sidewinders using their internal heat seekers alone. Below him, the Lincoln was a small, gray sliver in the vast ocean. The ship began to turn, creating a massive, white wake as it tried to present a smaller target. The carrier's escort destroyers moved into a protective screen. Their missile doors were open. 3 o'clock and 10 minutes in the afternoon. The entire Persian Gulf seemed to vibrate. The air turned a strange, metallic shade of gray. Every human being in the area felt the hair on their arms stand up. The static charge was so high that sparks began to jump between the metal surfaces of the cockpits. Major Miller on the E-3 looked at his watch. The second hand was moving backward. "Time is slipping," Miller whispered. "Something is happening to the local field." The count was now irrelevant. The positioning was irrelevant. 120 aircraft and a multi-billion-dollar carrier strike group were locked in a moment of maximum tension. Both sides had committed their lives, their ships, and their nations. They were waiting for the first spark. Then, the blue light from the Iranian formation expanded. It didn't flash. It grew until it swallowed the entire grid. 3 o'clock and 11 minutes in the afternoon. The blue light was absolute. Inside the E-3 Sentry, every computer screen turned a solid, blinding white. The flight controls went slack in the pilot's hands. The 4 massive engines did not flame out. They simply stopped. The roar of the jet turbines vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure. Major Miller tried to speak. No sound came out. He looked at the senior weapons coordinator. The man was frozen, not with fear, but as if he were a statue. A single drop of sweat was suspended in midair off the tip of his nose. It did not fall. 3 o'clock and 11 minutes and 30 seconds. Gravity had ceased to function within the skin of the aircraft. Outside, the Persian Gulf was a frozen painting. The wake of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a jagged, white sculpture of ice and foam. The F-18 Super Hornets were suspended in the air. Their pilots were motionless in their seats. The Iranian grid of 120 aircraft was no longer a collection of metal machines. It was a single, luminous block of blue energy. The matte black polygons in the center began to rotate. They spun with such speed they became blurred spheres. The rhythmic pulse reached a crescendo, a sound that was felt in the bone marrow rather than heard by the ear. 3 o'clock and 11 minutes and 45 seconds. 3 o'clock and 11 minutes and 45 seconds, the blue light began to contract. It pulled away from the edges of the Iranian fighters. It flowed toward the center of the grid, toward the 4 spinning spheres. As the light withdrew, the metal of the Iranian planes began to moan. The 4s, the 14s, the Mirages. They were being stripped of their electronic signatures. The air around them began to crackle with the sound of breaking glass. On the bridge of the Lincoln, the captain's eyes were wide, locked on the horizon. He was aware, but he could not blink. He watched as the sky above the Iranian formation began to fold. It looked like a piece of paper being creased by invisible hands. The blue sky turned black, then purple, then a color that did not belong in the human spectrum. 3 o'clock and 12 minutes. The 120 Iranian fighters were no longer in a grid. They were being pulled into the center. They did not collide. They compressed. They were being folded into a space smaller than a single cockpit. The metal did not scream. It hummed. Then, 3 o'clock and 12 minutes in the afternoon, the world snapped back into motion. The silence was shattered by a thunderclap that echoed from the coast of Iran to the shores of Oman. The kinetic energy of the atmosphere rushed back into the vacuum, left by the blue light. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, the bridge crew was thrown to the deck as the ship rocked violently. The sea, once frozen, surged in a massive, chaotic swell. On the E-3 Sentry, the engines roared back to life with a terrifying surge of power. Major Miller gasped for air. Gravity returned with a brutal force, slamming the mission crew into their seats. The drop of sweat that had been suspended in the air finally hit the console. "Status!" Miller shouted. His voice was hoarse. "Systems recovering!" the weapons coordinator yelled. "I have radar. I have link. I have everything. Where are they?" Miller leaned over the screen. The display was clean. The swarm of red icons that had dominated the Persian Gulf for the last hour was gone. The grid was empty. The 120 Iranian fighters had vanished. The 4 matte black polygons were gone. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was empty of everything except the American aircraft. 3 o'clock and 12 minutes and 30 seconds. "Search the surface," Miller ordered. "I want wreckage. I want oil slicks. I want parachutes." 120 planes do not just disappear. Inside his cockpit, Commander Harrison was fighting to keep his Super Hornet level. The air was incredibly turbulent. He scanned the horizon. He looked down at the water. "Control, this is Raven Lead," Harrison said. His breathing was ragged. "I have visual on the area. There is nothing. No debris, no smoke trails. The water is clear. It is like they were never here." 3 o'clock and 13 minutes in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian command bunker, Colonel Rezai stood in total darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, red glow over the room. His technicians were staring at their screens in a state of shock. "Report," Rezai whispered. "The signals are gone, Colonel," the operator said. "We have no telemetry." "Every transponder has been silenced. We are scanning the base return frequencies. Nothing. They did not come back." "The Americans?" Rezai asked. "The American carrier is still there," the technician replied. "They are launching search and rescue helicopters, but they are searching an empty ocean." Rezai sat down heavily. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was flickering. The seconds were ticking correctly again, but the date was wrong. It read a year that had not yet arrived. 3 o'clock and 15 minutes in the afternoon, the American E-3 Sentry began a wide orbit of the coordinates. Major Miller watched the infrared sensors. They were looking for heat signatures of pilots in the water. They found only the warm current of the Gulf. "Major," the coordinator said, "I have a single contact. It just appeared on the surface, 10 miles south of the original grid center." "Is it a pilot?" Miller asked. "No," the coordinator said. "It is an aircraft, a single 14 Tomcat. It is floating. The canopy is open." Miller keyed his radio. "Raven Lead, we have a floater. Vector to coordinates. We need eyes on." Harrison banked his jet and dove toward the water. He saw it. The sand-colored camouflage of the foreign fighter stood out against the deep blue of the sea. The plane sat perfectly level on the surface, as if placed by a crane. "I see it," Harrison said. "The pilot is in the cockpit. He is waving at me. Can you identify him?" Harrison flew as low as he dared, the roar of his engines kicking up a mist of salt water. He looked into the cockpit. Major Davari looked back at him. The Iranian pilot was not wearing his oxygen mask. He looked remarkably calm. He held up a single, white, piece of paper against the glass of his windscreen. The morning of the scramble was over. The mystery of the vanishing wing had just begun. 3:31 in the afternoon, the Persian Gulf. Commander Harrison held his Super Hornet in a tight, low-altitude orbit around the floating 14. The Iranian aircraft should have sunk. The Tomcat was a heavy, metal machine, yet it sat high in the water as if it were made of balsa wood. "Control, Raven Lead is on station," Harrison said. "The Iranian pilot is conscious. He is signaling. I am seeing a single sheet of paper. It has writing on it. I am going to try for a high-resolution camera pass." "Copy, Raven Lead," Major Miller responded from the E-3. "The Lincoln is vectoring a Seahawk helicopter to your position. ETA is 8 minutes. Maintain visual." Harrison toggled his targeting pod. The infrared and day television cameras zoomed in on the open cockpit. On his multifunction display, the image of Major Davari became crystal clear. The Iranian pilot looked directly into the camera lens. He did not look like a man who had just survived a supernatural event. He looked like a man who had been given a message. The paper in Davari's hand was covered in a dense, geometric script. It was not Farsi. It was not English. It looked like a series of interlocking circles and lines, drawn with mathematical precision. 3:34 in the afternoon. On the E-3, the data from Harrison's camera pass arrived. The mission crew crowded around the high-resolution monitor. "What is that?" the weapons coordinator asked. "Is that a code?" "It looks like a star chart," Miller said. "But the perspective is wrong. It is like looking at the galaxy from the outside." "Major," the controller interrupted, "I have more contacts. They are not in the air. They are on the surface." all over the Gulf. Miller looked at the master display. More icons were appearing. They were scattered across a 50-mile radius. 1, 5, 10, 20. Every icon was an Iranian fighter. "They are all back," the controller whispered, "but they are all in the water. Every single one of them." 3:37 in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian command bunker, the news was spreading. The reports from coastal lookouts and radar stations were identical. The missing wing had returned, but not to the air. 120 aircraft were bobbing in the waves of the Persian Gulf, like a fleet of ghost ships. Colonel Rezai grabbed the radio handset. "Phoenix 1, this is Control. Do you read me?" Static. Then, a voice. It was Major Davari, but his voice sounded different. It was calm, resonant. It carried the same rhythmic pulse that had taken over the electronics earlier. "Control," Davari said. "We have been shown the limit." "Major, what is your status?" Rezai asked. "Where are the others?" "We are all here, Colonel," Davari replied. "The aircraft are intact. The pilots are unharmed, but we cannot fly them again. The engines have been silenced. They told us that the sky belongs to those who do not use it for war." "Who told you?" Rezai demanded. "Who is they?" 3:40 in the afternoon. A U.S. Navy Seahawk helicopter hovered over Davari's floating 14. A rescue swimmer slid down the hoist line and splashed into the water. He swam to the side of the Tomcat and reached up. Davari didn't wait for help. He climbed out of the cockpit and handed the piece of paper to the swimmer. As soon as the swimmer took the paper, the 14 began to hum. The blue ionization returned for a split second, and then the aircraft vanished. Not with a flash, but with a silent ripple. The water rushed into the space where the jet had been, nearly pulling the rescue swimmer under. The Seahawk pilot radioed the Lincoln. "The target is gone. I repeat, the aircraft has dematerialized. We have the pilot. We have the document. Copy. Sea Knight," the carrier responded. "Bring him in." This just became a Level 5 intelligence event. Across the Gulf, the same scene was playing out. One by one, the floating Iranian jets were disappearing as soon as their pilots were rescued. The massive surge of air power that had threatened to start a war was being erased from existence. The morning of the scramble was over. The physical threat was gone. But as the American and Iranian crews watched the empty water, they realized the strategic balance of the world had just been deleted. 3:21 in the afternoon. The Persian Gulf. The massive coordination of the Iranian scramble had been replaced by a quiet, mechanical disappearance. One by one, the dots on the American radar screens were blinking out. They were not crashing. They were not landing. They were simply ceasing to be. On the E-3 Sentry, Major Miller watched the count drop from 120 to 80, then 60. Each time a pilot was pulled from the water by an American or Iranian rescue team, their aircraft vanished within seconds. It was a cleanup operation of terrifying efficiency. "Major," the weapons coordinator said, his voice barely a whisper. "The electronic signatures of the missing aircraft are not just gone. They are being erased from our playback buffers. I am looking at the recording from 10 minutes ago. The Iranian tracks are disappearing from the history logs." Miller looked over the man's shoulder. It was true. The digital trail of the most significant aerial event in history was being scrubbed from the hardware itself. The computer was being forced to forget what it had seen. 3:25 in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian command bunker, the situation was even more dire. Colonel Rezai watched as the mission logs on his main servers turned into gibberish. The names of the pilots, the tail numbers of the aircraft, the fuel consumption records, everything was being replaced by that same interlocking geometric script. "We are losing the records," a technician shouted. "Every hard drive in the facility is being rewritten. We have no proof this happened." Rezai looked at the 120 empty chairs in the ready room. "We have the men. They cannot rewrite the men." "Sir," the technician replied, "I just received a report from the medical wing. The pilots who have been returned to the coast. They are not speaking Farsi. They are not speaking English. They are speaking in tones. They are calm, they are healthy, but they are no longer our pilots." 3:28 in the afternoon. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, Major Davari was led into an interrogation room. He was still wet from the Gulf, wrapped in a gray navy blanket. He sat at the metal table, the geometric paper resting in front of him. The ship's intelligence officer entered the room. He placed a recorder on the table. Major Davari, I am Commander Vance. Can you tell me what happened to your wing? Davari looked up. His eyes seemed to hold a depth that unnerved the commander. He didn't look like a man under duress. He looked like a man who had seen the end of a very long movie. We were not scrambled by our commanders, Davari said. We were invited. We thought we were showing strength, but we were being shown our insignificance. Who invited you? Vance asked. The ones who keep the balance, Davari replied. They have watched you, and they have watched us. They saw the missiles being prepped. They saw the intent. They decided that the friction had become too great. So, they took the heat out of the system. Where are the planes, Major? They have been recycled, Davari said. The metal, the fuel, the weapons. They have been returned to the Earth in their raw forms. You will find no wreckage. You will find no evidence, only the memory. 3:30 in the afternoon, Major Miller on the E-3 Sentry received a direct order from the National Command Authority. The mission was over. The aircraft was to return to Al Udeid Air Base immediately. Control, this is Raven Lead. Commander Harrison's voice came through the radio. I am Bingo Fuel, returning to the Lincoln. But Major, I need to tell you something. Go ahead, Raven, Miller said. I just did a final sweep of the center point, Harrison said. The water where the polygons were. It isn't salt water anymore. My sensors are reading it as pure, distilled water. A circle exactly 1 mile wide. It is perfectly fresh. Miller leaned back in his seat. The geopolitical reality of the Persian Gulf had been shattered, not by a war, but by a demonstration of power that made the concept of a superpower look like a playground game. The Iranian Air Force was gone. The American sensors were being erased. And in the middle of a saltwater sea, a mile of fresh water sat as a silent, impossible monument. 3:31 in the afternoon. The Persian Gulf. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was now a vast, empty blue. The radar screens on the American E-3 Sentry were eerily quiet. For the first time in hours, there were no red icons, no flickering ghosts, and no physics-defying polygons. The transition from a potential world-ending conflict to total atmospheric silence had taken less than 90 seconds. Major Miller watched the screen. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Confirm all friendly tracks. All friendly assets accounted for. Sir. The weapons coordinator replied. The Lincoln Strike Group is holding position. Raven Flight is on deck. We are the only aircraft left in this sector. And the Iranians? Miller asked. Nothing. Not a single blade of a turbine is spinning between here and the coast. Their ground-based radars are still active, but they are stationary. They are not painting us. It is like they have simply stopped. 3:35 in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian command bunker, the silence was even more profound. Colonel Rezai stood among his staff, watching the empty displays. The massive mobilization, the years of maintenance, the secret stockpiles of fuel and parts, everything had been rendered irrelevant. The Iranian Air Force, as a tactical entity, had ceased to exist. Colonel, the junior analyst said, his voice trembling. The seismic sensors in the Gulf. They just picked up a massive displacement of mass. Not an explosion, a relocation. Relocation to where? Rezai asked. The coordinates are coming in now, the analyst said. It is inland, near the Kavir Desert. No population centers. Rezai grabbed the phone. He called the nearest army outpost to the coordinates. He waited for 3 minutes, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. When the voice on the other end finally spoke, Rezai's face went pale. They are there, Rezai whispered to his staff. 120 aircraft. They are sitting in the middle of the sand. No runways, no fuel trucks, just a perfect grid of fighters 500 miles from the ocean. The pilots are gone, but the planes are. They are arranged like museum pieces. 3:40 in the afternoon. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, the intelligence debrief of Major Davari had been suspended. The document he had provided was being scanned and transmitted directly to the National Security Agency. Commander Vance looked at Davari. "You said the pilots were unharmed. Where are they?" Davari smiled, a gentle, distant expression. "They are where they need to be. They are with their families. They were not taken to the desert with the machines. They were simply moved. Check your reports. You will find that every pilot who was in that grid is currently at home. They have no memory of the last hour. They only know that they are no longer soldiers." Vance didn't believe it. He stepped out of the room and hailed the bridge. "Check with the embassy contacts. Verify the status of the Iranian flight crews." 10 minutes later, the reply came back. It was impossible to confirm everything, but the early reports from intelligence assets in Tehran were consistent. Dozens of high-ranking pilots had been found in their homes, confused, still wearing their flight suits, but sitting at their kitchen tables. They were not traumatized. They were at peace. 3:45 in the afternoon. Major Miller authorized the final turn for the E-3 Sentry. As the massive aircraft banked toward its home base, Miller looked out the small porthole. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The Persian Gulf looked exactly as it had that morning. "Major," the coordinator said, "one last thing. The fresh water circle. It is gone. The salinity levels have returned to normal. There is no trace left." "I expected as much," Miller said. The crisis had resolved. There was no victory. There was no defeat. The two most powerful military forces in the region had been neutralized by a force that didn't even bother to identify itself. The world was the same, yet everything had changed. The machines of war had been treated as toys and put away by a parent who was tired of the noise. 9:15 in the evening. Langley, Virginia. The fluorescent lights of the Basement Analysis Center hummed. It was the only sound in the room. A group of 13 specialists sat around a mahogany table. They were staring at a screen that showed nothing but a flickering cursor. The data from the E-3 Sentry had been quarantined, but when the encryption keys were applied, the files were empty. "It is not a deletion," one analyst said. His voice was thin with exhaustion. "A deletion leaves a footprint. A digital scar. This is a vacuum. The sectors on the hard drives are in their factory original state. It is as if the mission never happened." The director of Central Intelligence leaned forward. "We have a carrier strike group with 5,000 witnesses. We have a pilot in custody. We have satellite imagery of 120 fighter jets sitting in the middle of a salt flat in the Caviar Desert. Explain the vacuum." The analyst shook his head. "We cannot. The physical world was altered, but the digital world was rewritten. Every sensor that touched those black polygons has had its memory sanitized. We are looking at a total technological bypass." 10:45 in the evening. Tehran. The atmosphere in the capital was one of hushed terror. There were no victory parades. There were no calls for holy war. The Iranian leadership was meeting in a bunker beneath the city. They had received the photos from the desert. The aircraft were arranged in a perfect, glistening circle. They were undamaged. Their fuel tanks were full. Their missiles were still on the rails, but the cockpit glass had been fused into solid, opaque crystal. Colonel Rezai sat at the far end of the table. He was no longer wearing his medals. He felt they were a mockery. "The pilots are refusing to speak," Rezai told the council. "They are not being defiant. They are simply different. They spend their time looking at the sky. They show no interest in the military." When we asked Major Davari's wingman why he would not return to duty, he told us that once you have seen the architect, you do not care about the building. The Minister of Defense slammed a fist on the table. "We have lost our entire air intercept capability in 1 hour. We are defenseless." "No," Rezai said quietly. "We are not defenseless. We are simply irrelevant. Both we and the Americans were treated like children with sharp toys. The toys were taken away. That is the strategic reality." 11:30 in the evening. The USS Abraham Lincoln. Commander Vance stood on the flight deck. The night air was warm and smelled of salt. The ocean was black and vast. He looked at the folder in his hand. It contained the scan of the document Major Davari had carried. The NSA had spent 5 hours on the symbols. They had found no match in any known language. But a linguist from Princeton had noticed something. The symbols were not words. They were mathematical constants. They were the values for the fine structure of the universe. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force. The document was a list of settings. They were showing us the dials, Vance whispered to himself. He looked up at the stars. For decades, the military had focused on the next stealth fighter, the next missile, the next radar. They had spent trillions of dollars to master the air. But in 60 minutes, that mastery had been exposed as an illusion. The sky did not belong to the F-35 or the J-20. It belonged to something that could turn gravity into a suggestion and metal into a memory. Vance watched a Seahawk helicopter land on the deck. Its lights flickered once, a brief, blue pulse. It was probably just a static discharge from the rotors, but Vance felt his heart skip a beat. The morning of the scramble was a matter of history, but the history books would never be able to record it. The world was moving into a new era, an era where the most advanced weapons were nothing more than museum pieces in the sand. 3 days later, the Defense Headquarters facility and the Foreign Military Tactical Air Command. The military analysis of the event had reached a terrifying conclusion. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration of absolute custody. Strategic experts from both nations had spent 72 hours in a state of silent shock. The realization was the same on both sides of the globe. The balance of power was no longer a human equation. The American strategic assessment was delivered in a windowless room deep beneath the earth. The report was only 4 pages long. It did not contain words like enemy or threat. Instead, it used words like intervention and neutralization. The final page of the assessment was a summary. It stated that the 120 foreign military aircraft were not captured. They were curated. The move to the desert was a tactical statement. It was a message that geography was a human limitation that did not apply to the observers. The fact that the pilots were returned home with their memories erased was a gesture of mercy that felt more like an insult to the military mind. In the Kavir Desert, the sun rose over the silent grid of fighters. The armed forces had cordoned off the area for 50 miles. Scientists in hazmat suits moved among the aircraft. They found no radiation. They found no heat. They found that the metal of the planes had been altered at the molecular level. The steel and aluminum were now harder than diamond, but lighter than air. One scientist touched the wing of a jet fighter aircraft. The metal felt warm. It vibrated with a faint, rhythmic pulse. It was the same pulse that had been recorded by the American E-3 Sentry. The aircraft were no longer weapons. They were transmitters. They were broadcasting a signal into the deep space above the desert, a signal that no human radio could decode. The strategic fallout was immediate. The foreign government announced a total cessation of all aerial exercises in the Gulf. The military forces moved the aircraft carrier strike group back to the Arabian Sea. The tension that had defined the region for half a century had evaporated. It was replaced by a shared, cold realization. Modern warfare is a game played in the dark. Both nations had spent decades trying to see further into that darkness. They had built better eyes, faster missiles, stealthier wings, but they had forgotten to ask if they were alone in the room. Now they had their answer. They were not just being watched, they were being managed. The final thought in the American debrief was written by an anonymous intelligence officer. It was the only part of the report that was not technical. We have spent a century perfecting the art of the kill. The report read, "We have reached the peak of our technological capability, and at the very moment we were ready to use it. The universe reached down and took the gun out of our hands. We are not the masters of the sky. We are the guests." And the host is no longer being polite. The desert wind blew across the crystal cockpits of the missing wing. The planes sat in their perfect rows, silent, powerful, and completely useless. They were monuments to a form of power that human history was not yet ready to understand. The sky over the Persian Gulf remained blue and empty. The radars continued to sweep the horizon, but the operators no longer looked for fighters. They looked for the light. They looked for the pulse. And they waited for the next time the architect decided to change the settings.